Rizu. We're going to move into our panel discussion now, and so I'm going to just invite our panelists just to unmute themselves. Welcome, first of all, to Alison Phillips. Alison is editor of the Daily Mirror. Welcome, Alison. Darshna Soni is Home Affairs correspondent for Channel 4 News. Basit Mahmood, freelance journalist and editor of Left Foot Forward. Lexie Kirkconnell-Kawana, who is head of standards at Regulator in Press, and Brian Cathcart, professor of journalism and author at Kingston University. So shall we just welcome them with, I don't know, an emoji or a kind of something like that. It's really lovely to have you all here, and I appreciate the time that you're giving for this conversation. So Rizu has given us and painted a really comprehensive picture of the problems that we face. She's touched on some of the practices and recommendations that perhaps we can maybe move into now to think about. I'd just like to ask our panelists, in their day-to-day work, what do they feel has and hasn't changed, maybe in recent years? Because we've been aware of this problem of misrepresentation for a long time. So has anything changed? Has anything changed? Are there any positives that, first of all, we can say, actually, yes, I've noticed this and I've noticed that? And then maybe we can move on to some of the things that are proving to be particularly difficult to change and or to remove from our reporting. Who wants to maybe start with some of the positives about maybe things that we've seen have been changing in the last year or two? Anyone want to begin with that?
I'll come in.
Thank you, Darshna.
I have been covering Home Affairs for quite a long time now at Channel 4 News, so quite a number of years. I've covered a lot of the big terrorist attacks of recent times, way back from 7/7 onwards. Some of the more recent ones at London Bridge, for example. I think there's been a huge change. I think that people generally now in newsrooms are much more aware of some of the issues that Riz raised. And I think you have to distinguish between different types of the media. I noticed, Riz, you kept using the term mainstream media. I find that a little bit problematic because I work for the mainstream media. I work for Channel 4 News. I'm quite proud to work for them. I think we've got a great track record of covering these issues. So I think we have to distinguish between different parts of the media and the way they cover these stories. Some of the headlines that you showed, which were quite shocking, you would never see on our programme, for example. And I think the broadcast media generally have much stricter guidelines. We have to follow Ofcom rules. There's no way we could get away with, some of the images that were shown. And I think things like jumping to conclusions about whether an attack was a terrorist attack, using images of people, if you're illustrating a story, using a picture of a mosque, for example, we wouldn't ever do that on TV unless it was completely relevant to the story. So I think on a positive note, I think things have changed recently, and I think there is much more awareness in some parts of the media, although of course not all parts of the media.
Thank you, Darshna. I mean, Alison, can I come to you, because a lot of what Rizu has shared with us, a lot of it's been headlines and images, and actually maybe when you go into the story itself, there is maybe not so much misrepresentation, but there seems to be a particular issue. Is it with our sub-editors? And I mean, is this about just brevity sometimes and laziness, or impact? And I am not wanting to excuse that, but I mean, are you seeing, in terms of headline writers and picture desks, any positive changes, but also maybe some practices and that maybe need to change?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of how things have changed, I mean, I can only, well, firstly, I'll start off just by speaking a bit that I can control, which is the mirror. And I think we've changed a lot over the last few years. Probably a lot of that might be in no small part to Rizu herself, who we've got a fantastic relationship with, who we came into contact with when I can't remember, there was a story that that wasn't good, the way we'd reported it, and we built up a relationship from there. And that has led to such things as better training and education for staff. It's led to, if anything slips through the net, which hopefully it never does, then, you know, Rizwa will just call me or text me or whatever, or one of her team will, or, you know, if anybody flags something to her, it gets flagged to us and we're able to deal with it immediately. And I think, and also there's another thing that we do, we have like a twice yearly editorial feedback panel where we talk to all sorts of different people from various different communities about how they feel we have reported on issues that impact on them in the preceding 6 months, and also other issues that are on the kind of wider news agenda. So we've put sort of various bits of system in place to try and reduce. I mean, I think we have to be mindful that, you know, I think there's probably a societal systemic issue around Islamophobia. Therefore, if we accept that as a thing, therefore there is going to be, you're going to have some people in newsrooms that are going to be, you know, impacted upon that. And so I think a lot of what we're trying to do generally is ensuring that our journalists look to themselves and think broadly and examine themselves quite toughly about what they think and why they think it, and why they think this is an appropriate headline, why they think it's not an appropriate headline. And therefore to ensure you've got culture, also a big thing where you've got culture where anybody in that newsroom, doesn't matter what role they are in, if they feel something that they don't think is right, they don't feel comfortable, or they think that, then they feel free to flag it, and that as a result it's done. So on your point about headlines and brevity, yes, obviously headlines, particularly in the popular press, need to be short and they need to be snappy, but I don't, and also obviously, you know, you've got to have this conversation looking at digital as well, where, you know, you're looking at traffic and certain headlines will cause, but we've looked at this a lot, and actually we haven't seen any horrendous problems with traffic or with print circulation by doing headlines which are appropriate and are right and are fair. So it's not a massive, it's not going to cost you loads in traffic, it's not going to cost you loads in sales. So it's just really a case, I think, of ensuring that you have a culture in your newsroom where you're prepared to learn and change, rather than just think, oh yeah, we're in charge of the backbench, we're in charge of the national agenda, we'll do what we want. So I think once you've got that kind of learning and developing culture in, that's great. There's something else I was going to say, I've forgotten. But I think other organisations, I think probably are starting to look. I can't really talk for others, but I think generally, as Darshna said, it feels to me that nationally we're in quite a different position than we were, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Because it just occurs to me as well that as journalists, we're often trained to put as much detail into our stories and into our headlines, and yeah, I'm seeing that actually that's where, you know, some of this is problematic, isn't it? That in headline writers, journalists striving to just pack in more adjectives and more detail, they're actually grabbing at the wrong ones. Or, you know, so I'm just wondering, is there something even more fundamental that we need to, and I'm sorry, I'm not just addressing this to you, Alison, but to our panel, you know, is there something more fundamental? Because this doesn't just affect.
We've just got to be empathetic. So our first sort of starting point on every story really is just people. You've got to treat people, as individuals, and with respect, rather than lumping lots of people into a group. And, you know, it's just about treating people with empathy and as people.
Yeah. Panel, anyone else want to come in on this?
I mean, I would say, I mean, I'm an admirer of Alison's, and I should be embarrassed by that. But you know, and she's an example of good leadership in this field, and that's great. Unfortunately, she's the exception in the national press. The pattern is not. We're not going to get nice leadership from the Telegraph, the Sun, the Mail, the Times. that we're just not going to get that. These are organizations which are happy to engage in Islamophobic journalism when it suits them. I would say we're not at the crest of a wave of that at the moment. We're at a kind of midpoint. It's not as intense as it has been. Rizwana is the one who monitors these things most closely, but that's my feeling. But when it suits them, they will crank it up again, and they do it deliberately. And you can, you know, if you look, for example, Rizwana mentioned the case of the Christian child forced into Muslim foster care, but that's not the only case of its kind. And there are huge instances, the whole grooming gangs controversy, the Trojan horse controversy, where journalists from basically these right-wing papers were only too happy to engage in that. So we have to think not just about the idea of giving them good leadership, because the people who own these organizations are not going to give them good leadership. That's not what they're in this business for. We have to look at regulation. We have to look at ways, and this is not bizarre. Everybody in every walk of life in this country, apart from journalism pretty well, is regulated. They understand regulation. You know, I'm a university teacher, I'm regulated. You're a university teacher, you're regulated. I mean, you know, we know what that's like, and we don't regulate ourselves. But you know, the state of things in the world of print journalism, and you know, you heard from Darshna about the better state of Ofcom regulation. The national press is very badly regulated. And I will just I'll leave you with a simple fact. A study by Westminster University of 4 years of activity of Ipso showed that they had received, I think it was 16,000 complaints relating to discrimination. Of those, 2 were upheld, and neither of those was anything to do with religion or race. So Ipso, the press regulator, the principal press regulator, the one that deals with most of our national press, and indeed the code of practice, which extends beyond Ipso to the Guardian and the Financial Times, this does not permit effective regulation to protect Muslims. Simply doesn't. The entire career of Ipso, they've never upheld a complaint. You've seen all these examples, never upheld a complaint relating to Islamophobia.
Well, thank you, Brian. That probably leads us on to you, Lexie, because we're on to regulation now, aren't we? And Brian's just been giving us some stats there about Ipso. I mean, what are you seeing in press? And can you maybe just explain for us, you know, whether how Ipso and Impress perhaps differ in their approach to this topic, if they do?
Certainly, yes. Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Brian, for that lead-in. And essentially, that is the issue. It's an issue of how, you know, you can address some of these issues on an ad hoc basis, but with very targeted approaches. And, you know, a big part of Rizwana's work is acting as that sort of voice, that monitor of these issues when they happen on their individual basis. But the issue is systemic. We know it's systemic, and so what it needs is systemic solutions. And systemic solutions come in the form of better regulation. That's having common standards of what is acceptable and non-acceptable journalism, having adequate accountability and oversight, and there also being incentives for journalists and editors and newsrooms to participate in that project, and it not being sort of pulling teeth and dragging them to it, but then wanting to be active and proactive and engaging in all the positive aspects of regulation as well. So Impress is the only approved self-regulatory body for the press. It's been approved as being effectively independent and able to regulate the press, and that's based on a number of core pillars. One, we're completely independent of the press, so no sitting editor as part of our governing body. We're independently funded. We're funded through a charitable organisation, so we're not funded directly through levy of our members. So our members have no control or say over how we regulate them. And we also are required to have a standards code that is both requires accuracy and non-discrimination to be at its core, but effectively balances the public interest and freedom of expression. And that's a very different type of regulator than other complaints bodies out in the journalism and the news space. And I think what's important here when we're talking about addressing systemic issues of Islamophobia in the media, that first issue I raised about having common standards is a really important one, because there are multiple codes of practice out there about how journalists should be reporting on issues of Muslim communities and Islam, and there are very different applications out there. So yes, there's the Ofcom code, there's the Impress code, there's the NUJ code, there's the Editors Code of Practice, and they all treat this issue very differently. So if you're a reader or an audience member going into a different type of news space, you can expect different standards, and that's really confusing for readers. And yes, there should be different types of news out there that has different emphasis and tones on different subject matters, but the lack of a common position, one that defers to basic rights, like the right to be free from discrimination, that is engaged and in concert with community, is part of the challenge here. And not having that homogenous universal standard, that benchmark of what journalists should and shouldn't be able to report. And what I'm talking about here is discriminatory reporting, like we've seen through the presentation today, is a real issue. And then building in accountability to that. So if something bad happens, it's not this game of whack-a-mole of trying to deal with individual stories, but what is going to address the systemic problems. You know, it might be on occasion journalists get it wrong sometimes, but when you start to see these patterns emerge, you know, where is the redress? Where is the adequate oversight and accountability to ensure that if there's ideological issues in editorial practice, those are being addressed? That's something that Impress is able to do, but that other regulators are sort of, for want, haven't done in this space. So we've got, excellent groups like the Centre for Media Monitoring undertaking these investigations, academics and researchers undertaking these investigations, but we're not seeing regulators address widespread Islamophobia in the media and then taking action that's necessary to address that.
So, I mean, do you detect, Lexie, any appetite amongst the other regulators for at least having a discussion with each other about some kind of common benchmark? I mean, obviously, I understand the pressures or the incentives for having different regulatory bodies. I mean, that's a separate issue. But on specific topics like Islamophobia, do you sense any appetite for regulators to come together and saying, okay, well, on this topic, we can agree and we can create some kind of common framework? Or, I mean, I'll put that to you, Lexie, and to the rest of the panel, where if they have any knowledge of this.
Well, I think when we think about the news space and how wide and diverse it is, we do have broadcasters, radio, podcasters, a huge wealth now of online social news. And then we have what you might call the kind of traditional print journalism or news market. It's a huge disparate group. And so having a common position is challenging just from that perspective, how you apply in all those different mediums and forms. But if we think about how much of that market is quote unquote regulated effectively, it's a really small proportion. And that's part of the problem as well. So even though we now have at Impress over 200 news brands that reach 17 million readers a month, that's a huge proportion of the news market. The news market is so widespread and diverse that actually the vast majority of the news market sits outside of any form of regulation. And that's a kind of enduring issue as well, is that even if you had the regulators that were, independent, effective regulators come together, they're still not going to cover a huge part of the news market that sits outside of regulation. And that's one of the kind of enduring legacies of sort of the press freedom, libertarian view of regulation in the UK and beyond. And in terms of being regulated. At the moment, it's voluntary to sign up to a regulator. If you're a licensed body like a broadcaster or a radio, you're required to be licensed under Ofcom. But anyone else who's acting as a news provider or a journalist in the space, there's no requirement to be regulated. And that's a real issue with there not being effective incentives to sign up to a regulatory body, because yes, by signing up to a body, being subject to fines, being subject to investigations, that is a fetter on your kind of absolute commercial freedom and bottom line. But the vast majority choosing not to is the sign of a system that's failing, essentially, that we don't have a settlement where the vast majority of news providers are regulated and regulated to some sort of common standards. So I think that's our first step. How do we incentivize as many journalists and news providers to adopt regulation? And then when we've got that sort of, critical mass, we can begin to have a dialogue with the sector and communities about what the standard would be.
Thank you, Lexie. Basit, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I just think, hi. So I only went into the media 4.5 years ago, literally after, I think it's easy to talk in newsrooms about regulation. I think, Darshna raised a good point that it's important to distinguish between different media outlets and broadcasters and newspapers, and there's positives, but I think sometimes editors don't understand. I remember the EDL in Britain first holding up pictures of some newspapers as they attacked Muslims in the streets of Luton. I don't think many editors and journalists realise that. And I think one thing in our profession we have to be totally honest about, it's the second most socially exclusive profession in the country. There was a report that came out last week that 80% of journalists, come from, middle or upper class backgrounds. And the majority of the Muslim community in this country, half live in the 10 poorest local authority areas in the country. So we can talk about regulation and headlines, but I think it's easy to give into that groupthink mentality that exists within our profession, where, I worked at the Metro slap bang in the middle of London, and I was the only permanent ethnic minority employee for the website. So I think maybe at least, before getting defensive, at least bring in some Muslim journalists into your newsrooms. I think that could massively improve your output and stop you making the silly mistakes that you make. For example, I remember wire copy is something that we don't release. It's not always down to the individual journalist. Sometimes in good faith, they may take an agency copy. I remember, Anjum Chowdhury, horrible human being. There was a wire copy that came in that said, Anjum Chowdhury was spotted at McDonald's, and then it said, and Muslims aren't allowed to go to McDonald's because it's not halal. I know plenty of Muslims that go to McDonald's to have a filet of fish or a McFlurry, and that frustrated because it was copied in, and it was only when I randomly managed to see it and raise, a flag and say, look, this isn't actually true, that the journalist took it out. It's not always, bad faith actors. Sometimes those kind of mistakes happen. But I think in the first thing we as a profession need to be doing is finding out why we're so socially exclusive, because that works to the detriment of Muslims and young British Muslims who have become politicized and want to become involved in the media, but unfortunately they just don't have the opportunity because over 90% of internships in our profession are unpaid.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you, Basit. Well, I just want to remind our audience, we want to hear your questions. So now's a good chance, opportunity to put those into the chat just while we have a couple of final comments from our panelists. Just finally then, panelists, aside from what the recommendations we've already heard, what else can we do? What else? Are there any easy wins here? We've talked about some of the systemic stuff that needs to change in terms of recruitment, in terms of regulation. That's obviously important, but and I guess maybe there are some easy wins within that. Not so sure. But are there any other? And I'm also thinking about my student journalists. What are some of the basic things? We've talked about empathy and putting ourselves in people's shoes. Is there anything else we should be telling them about how to do this better? Panelists, or any other thoughts that you might have that you want to bring to us before we turn to the questions from our audience? Just put your hand up if you want to. Brian.
Yeah, I think there's as I say, like you, I'm a teacher of journalists, and I think I have long felt an anxiety about create an environment to teach journalists in which they're understanding, they're empathetic, they are rigorous, they pursue the truth, and they hold the truth in the highest possible regard. Those things you can nurse in a university environment. I know very well from my, from observing over many years that a lot of students go out into work from those kinds of backgrounds, go out into workplaces where they meet a kind of cynicism which says, yeah, okay, that was great for university. Just park that, because you've got to get on with the job now. And I think we've got to overcome that, because what it's doing is it's eroding trust in journalism in a catastrophic way. But it's also extremely bad for the country, and extremely bad for example, Muslims who get on the wrong end of it. There's a lot of harm caused. A lot of people suffer because of this bad journalism. So it's recognizing that the cynicism of newsrooms, of some newsrooms, is something to be challenged and to be fought. That's rather than to be complied with because that's the way the job is. Now, that's a big ask of young journalists leaving university. But that's I see that as a really important element, and I see I'll mention regulation again. I see good regulation as underpinning that kind of approach, helping the honest journalist in bad environments.
Thank you, Brian. And yes, Basit, do you want to come in again on that?
The only other thing I was going to say was, when I did I know a lot of journalists who did the NCTJ. I know that's not the only route into journalism, but I was quite surprised that on the modules that we were learning, there was no, alongside what Brian said with regulation, there was no module on, we had modules on local government, on, councils, but there was nothing on religious literacy, nothing. And this was only 3 years ago. And I don't mind it. I'm not someone who's going to get offended, if someone doesn't know, it's always good to ask a question. But I remember a journalist saying, what's Shia, what's Sunni? And this was in a national newsroom. And that's fine, but that's something that should have probably been dealt with earlier. So maybe even having a basic module in the NCTJ or MAs in journalism on religious literacy would go a long way.
That's a great idea, and I'm seeing some thumbs up there as well from our audience. Rizu.
Yeah, and I was just going to say we're currently in conversations. I mean, that's something we've been proposing to the NCTJ, that, religious literacy definitely needs to. But I'm also kind of delivering these masterclasses at various schools of journalism, and they do have modules that are on race and religion, or ethics modules into which this fits. But they've all said that if the NCTJ actually make it compulsory, it's easier for us to then fit it into our modules. But I'd just like to add on to, in terms of what's needed, apart from recruitment of journalists from all kinds of backgrounds, not just Muslims, all kinds of backgrounds, in order to kind of reflect society more. I think that's the first step. Second step, though, and for me, it's the most important, because unfortunately, the conversations we're having today, I had when I first joined the BBC in 1988. It's no different. Things have moved to a certain extent in terms of representation on screen, especially in broadcast. You can see far more diverse faces there, but behind the scenes, things haven't changed enough. And then in levels of seniority and editorial decision making, things haven't changed enough. But also what you find is, once people are recruited, there is a lot of pressure on journalists from minority backgrounds. And I'm part of the Ethical Journalism Network's UK committee, and they're doing a piece of research at the moment looking at racism within newsrooms. And the kind of things that are coming out is the kind of mental health issues that many people face because of the peer pressures and the dominant culture of newsrooms that exists, that there's a particular perspective and there's a paradigm and a lens through which stories are seen and reported. And I think until the recruitment of different people is reflected in the output and the perspectives and the opinions within the content, I don't think we'll begin to see real change. Secondly, it's about retention. I kind of attended the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity launch the other day, and speaking to a lot of Black and Asian journalists who've been in the trade a long time, and the kind of fatigue of this ongoing battle to get things onto the agenda, and the slow pace of change is really wearing, wearing in terms of people having mental breakdowns, and then also people being stuck, going for jobs that they know they're fully qualified for, but they never get. And then, facing that glass ceiling and then actually leaving. So the number of Black and Asian and not necessarily Muslim, but minority kind of journalists leaving the profession because things are just not changing, they're not moving. And that's the kind of hard face of it when you're in there and working within an environment that, with all the goodwill that's there, the actual day-to-day experiences of people are really, really bad. And it's about retention, and how do you keep those experienced people? How do you get them into decision-making processes so that editorially their voices are being heard? And how do you allow different perspectives to be in the output content? Because we're communicators at the end of the day. We're communicators and information bearers. And if that information is solely from one perspective and a cultural paradigm, then we're not reflecting the audiences that we're purporting to serve.
Thank you, Rizwana. So I guess that comes back to what Brian was talking about. We need better leadership, don't we? In all our news organizations, regardless of the type of media they work in. Anybody else want to come in on anything that Rizu has said there, or about how we can get better leadership?
I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that a lot of these organizations, that they are businesses, and audiences are becoming more shrewd and more cynical, and are turning away from a lot of what we might call traditional sources of news because of the very issues that have been raised, that they don't serve audiences, they don't reflect the public interest, they don't represent the communities that they see and are from on a day-to-day basis. And really there's a lot of power in within audiences and with audiences, and without the other sort of systemic changes that we would like to see. It is enough for readers and viewers and audiences to demand more of these organizations, and whether it's targeting with nudges, their readers, advertisers, funders of news, and demanding that they have better news, better sources, better journalism, because if it stops being commercially viable for these businesses to do bad journalism, that might be enough to encourage the systemic change, to see the changes in leadership and filter down as well. So I think sometimes, as an individual, it can feel really difficult and disempowering to be like, this is this huge systemic problem, there's nothing I can do. But actually, for audiences, there's a lot of power in switching off and switching on to news sources that do better.
I mean, Alison, can you see amongst your competitors, some of whom might be a little bit more right-leaning, can you see, any kind of ray of hope? Is it possible in some of these other news organizations for people to do essentially the right thing and to convince those above them, the people, the shareholders, whatever, that actually there is a business, as Lexie says, actually there is a business case here for doing the right thing?
Well, I think society is always changing, and the needs of your customers or readers are always changing, and also of your advertisers, of course. And so, those are all drivers. If an editor wants to create a paper or a website or a social media feed which is engaging, then they need to sort of change with those societal shifts. And also, I think, as Lexie said earlier, I think sometimes I feel that this conversation can really fixate on the established print media, which is still I don't deny it's still incredibly influential in this country, But an awful lot of people are getting their news and their content from a whole myriad of other sources as well. So, you know, we have to bear that in mind as well. And you know, in a lot of those places, I think there is some really positive journalism being done. I think so. I think I mean, I completely take Riz's point. She's been doing this work for 30 years and is, you know, feeling that little progress has been made. I feel, just as an observer and a, you know, sort of prolific reader of news, that I think there has been change. Maybe, as Brian said, you know, we might be in a trough at the moment. Maybe something will happen that might, you know, there could be a resurgence. But in terms of how we try to move forward, I think it's absolutely about recruitment. It's absolutely, and recruitment's almost the easy bit. Retention's the hard bit that we all need to really, really focus on. And then training, and that certainly there should be an NCTJ model on this, but maybe we need to think more about kind of career-long training opportunities for journalists, so that, you know, the idea that you could have a training when you're 18 or 20, and then that's supposed to sort of give you everything you need to equip you for the next 30, 40 years seems a bit mad. So, you know, maybe there's those sort of things that we need to think about. And I think, you know, conversations such as these, where I think sometimes in journalism, there's a lot of defensiveness. I think sometimes I think that's a thing that probably stretches back centuries, as the way journalists have operated. And I think if we can start to move through that, and of course, obviously, you know, young journalists that are coming through have got different requirements from the workplace as well. They don't want to work in some particular places, so that's having an impact as well. So there's lots of different factors which I hope will bring about more change, but maybe probably not fast enough.
Can I just say, in terms of change, and, you know, obviously I've been kind of critical, but I would uphold defending, you know, journalism and the profession. And given the kind of rise of social media and what's online and fake news and, you know, disinformation, misinformation, that ultimately, you know, we have to have a thriving industry of journalism that actually does uphold the highest standards, and I would defend that, you know. But in terms of change, we've worked quite closely with the Sun, and actually from what we used to complain, we rarely complain to the Sun at the moment. So now that may be, you know, something in terms of the engagement and the willingness and our evidence base. It may be some other reason why they have, but actually we have seen a change from the Sun having had the worst headlines about Muslims to that having decreased now, and less content that is inaccurate, or, you know, less misleading headlines or imagery and things. So that is positive. You know, we've seen that there. Obviously with Alison, we've been engaging very closely with the Mirror, and, you know, it's not to say that mistakes aren't still made. And like Alison said, we're on the phone very quickly or send an email very quickly. And so change, you know, it will happen. It's slow, but we just have to keep pushing those boundaries further and further, and holding people to account, and, you know, asking for transparency, and asking for, as you said, training, but recruitment, upholding, and having ethical journalism, you know, ethical journalism, so that you are operating in a way that ultimately, yeah, is ethical and respects and kind of reports in a way that's accountable.
Yeah, absolutely ethical and I guess inclusive. I mean, I'm just looking at our comments in the chat box, and, you know, lots of people just saying yes. It's about inclusivity, isn't it? As well. So, well, thank you, panelists. Let's look at some of these questions. So Ala Nawar is saying, is there anything our panelists want to say about representation specifically of Muslim women? And she's saying here, especially Middle Eastern women, and representations that are often used to justify the brutal invasions on our countries to, in quotes, free Muslim women. Anything, I mean, have we seen, panelists, any specific examples of that? I don't know, Rizu, in your work, whether you've come across that often, and and whether there's a specific, you know, issue that we need to address regarding Muslim women and the representation of Muslim women.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are the kind of general tropes of Muslim women are oppressed, have no agency, being forced to wear the hijab. And what was interesting, I had a call, and I won't mention which news organization it was from or which managing editor, but obviously there's a social media campaign at the moment to support the Muslim women journalists in Afghanistan and against the Taliban's kind of law for them to wear the veil and the niqab. And this editor was saying, you know, do you think it's okay for us to do that? Because journalists are asking for journalists and editors here to wear a mask in support of, you know, Muslim women, but for not having them. And I said, look, that's your decision, and yes, support it, because, you know, nobody should be forced to. I said, would you equally join a campaign that gives Muslim women the right to wear the hijab? And I don't think they would feel as comfortable joining in one of those campaigns, because when it comes to Muslim women, it's the bottom line is always that we are oppressed and we're forced to do things, and we're forced to specifically wear the hijab. And the hijab has become a politicized, you know, dress code that's been used by everyone from the far right to sections of the media to portray Muslim women in a particular way. But it's interesting that even left-leaning, and I would say kind of liberal left-leaning publications and journalists have a problem when it comes to Muslim women, because it's very difficult for people to kind of get across that idea that, one, because obviously journalism and journalists are said to come from a very secular background, which I don't think is true, having kind of spoken to many journalists within newsrooms, but to accept that religion can be a guiding force within your life, and as a result of that, you choose to wear a headdress or dress in a particular way, but that does not mean X, Y, and Z. But to come out in support of that. So if I started a campaign today and said, look, journalists, I want you to support a campaign which talks about the right of a woman to choose what she wants to wear, including the headscarf, I think a lot of people would still have problems with that. So there's a psychological barrier there towards the rights of women and Muslim women. And that's kind of quite interesting for me. I don't know whether, you know, other people want to have a comment on that, but it just struck me when they were very willing as kind of editors and journalists to join a campaign, and rightly, to defend the rights of Afghani women journalists. Would they join the same campaign to defend the rights of Muslim women wearing the headscarf or choosing to dress in a particular way, which is counter to a Western dress code? Just a question.
Yeah, good question. Anybody else want to come in on that? No. Okay. Thank you, Rizu. Katie is asking, and these next two questions really are about teaching journalism students. Katie's asking, I'd be interested to hear you speak about when you would consider challenging as Islamophobic things like using pictures of women in the hijab as lazy shorthand. She's saying here, I'm thinking about marking student work and also the challenges in pulling students up on these things in their work when they've seen it printed everywhere. Yeah, so I think, do we understand the question there? You know, when would we, and Katie, if you want to just help me here by, if you need to elaborate on your, on the phrasing of your question there, but am I getting that right? That you want to know when is it right to challenge things as Islamophobic? Is that what you're asking, Katie? If you're still there, Katie?
She unmutes herself and maybe asks the question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Hang on, Katie. Let's find where you are, and I'll unmute you. Try that now, Katie.
Wow, thank you, Ian. So I was thinking, Rizzy, when you were talking about, you were showing us the images, there was a man praying sort of at a window that had bars, and it was being used as a kind of a sloppy shorthand to talk about people who are terrorists in prisons, and you showed us that how they changed the picture in the next copy to be a generic prison shot. And I was thinking about when we're looking at students' work, they sort of look at examples that they see in print and sort of emulate or replicate some of those same sorts of things. And just the challenges, I would be interested to hear your perspective on pulling that up. And because there's just a lot of nuance in there, isn't there? Like, at what point do you say to a student, because we don't see their work over a long period of time necessarily, so we wouldn't necessarily be able to say, as a portfolio, you're starting to develop or repeat tropes of Islamophobia. So do you see sort of where I'm coming from? Like, we would pull it up anyway, but I just think there's kind of a fine line between repetition of sort of lazy caricatures, if you like, and deliberate Islamophobia or other forms of racism.
Thank you, Katie.
It seems to me to be a sort of, is the line in how many times it's used, or is it enough just to challenge the practice?
I don't know, Rizzy, would you want to come in on that?
I kind of understand. I think it would be both. I think it's about challenging and then, you know, looking at the generality of the practice. I think a lot of this also is about stock images, because I know a lot of stock images get used, and there's kind of very little representation of Muslims within stock images that are used. But I think one of the things when it comes to Muslims and Islam, one of the basic questions that journalists can ask themselves, if this story was about a Catholic person, a Jewish person, a Christian person, or a person of no faith at all, would they still mention and report it mentioning religion or the identity of the person, or, you know, associating something with that particular group? And I think that's what Alan Moses was kind of saying when he was leaving IPSO, that what he had found, and probably as a result of a lot of kind of complaints that we were making and evidence we were giving him, is that really Muslims seem to be covered in a way that other religions are not covered. And if you just would ask yourself, well, while you're covering this story, is the religion relevant to this story? Because what we found is, even when it comes to, you know, simple acts of crime, there was one story, there was a butcher, that's right, and he had been part of a drug scandal. Now, the drug-related crime had absolutely nothing to do with his religion, but the headline and the story were framed as halal butcher involved in drug scandal. So the mention of halal there, the fact, you know, it's irrelevant. So I think it's about relevance and irrelevance. It's about how often the same kind of images are used. It is about the nuance, I think. It's about the blatant, and I've shown you quite a lot of blatant kind of examples. But I think as a lecturer, as somebody who's wanting tomorrow's journalists to, you know, uphold slightly higher standards when it comes to reporting on Muslims and Islam, I think it's incumbent on you to kind of discuss. It's not about pointing fingers or kind of blaming, but it's about discussing, informing yourself and the student about the connotations and the subliminal messages, especially when it comes to imagery. We know how powerful imagery is, and we know how it's used to subliminally suggest things. And so, you know, I don't know on journalism how much imagery is kind of part. I remember studying John Berger in my days, you know, and the power of kind of imagery and things, but I don't know how much that is. But imagery is really, really powerful, as our headlines. But even in broadcast, I mean, I didn't give a lot of examples of broadcast, and that's probably because I think the problem lies primarily in print. But equally in broadcast, we find, and we did find images during COVID of mosques being used in broadcast when talking about general situations in Blackburn and Darwin, for example. And yes, they do have high proportions of Muslims there. But again, you know, landmark buildings that exist in those two places. But what was chosen was to focus on mosques or other things when there's been coverage of Daesh, or as they're called, ISIS or IS, when they're talking about terrorism, actually honing in on people praying, for example, and this is news footage. So, you know, what happens there is the kind of subliminal association of everyday Muslim practices being associated with extremism or violence or terrorism, or, you know, not kind of adhering to certain rules and things like that. So imagery, I would say, is really, really important and should be discussed. And
yeah, thank you, Rizu. I'm just going to quickly ask for Anna's question before we go. Again, for Anna, teaches at university. Hardly any of my students read newspapers or keep up with the news. They've already switched off. Do you think in part this is due to these bad practices and lack of representation? I mean, are we seeing that? I mean, I don't know if in our viewership, our readership, that actually this misrepresentation, this lazy stereotyping, generalization is leading, you know, young people, young readers to switch off because they just can't identify with it. I don't know if anyone wants to quickly.
Well, I think I mean, this is very complex. I mean, one thing, certainly trust in journalism is in a pretty bad way, and particularly trust in print journalism in this country. So, you know, that is going to turn people off. Another, of course, is that, you know, we're in a world where, you know, I mean, I could say attention spans are short, but there is a lot of stuff coming at you. And you know, there are lots of other things you could be thinking about or doing, and we're all online all the time. It's just that kind of torrent of stuff. So you know, being aware of news in the kind of organized way that meant you bought a newspaper in the morning and you turned the pages, that's gone. I mean, we've got to face that, and it's a more chaotic system. At the same time, and I suppose also in a further more general way, we're existing in a world of politics where, frankly, the examples from the top are not good. I mean, they could not be worse. They encourage cynicism, skepticism, disgust, all of those things. This is not an idealistic world on any level. For younger people, they're seeing the Prime Minister lie all the time. Well, you know, that's not helping. I mean, it is complex. But I also think my experience as a teacher has been that, and this sounds like, you know, crusty old man says this, but that young people are in fact these days full of empathy. They are they're well plugged into that idea, and actually teaching them, you know, inspired me. But it also, you know, it's kind of easy to point them in the right directions. They want to get it right about race. They want to get it right about religion. They want to get it right about trans people. They, you know, and I think Rizwana's point, you know, stock images, once they're alert to the risks of stock images, of pushing the button, getting the picture and sticking it on the story, once they're, you know, they're it seems to me quite quick on that. I'm kind of optimistic about them, except in the sense of, you know, that old thing which I mentioned earlier about them leaving university and going sometimes into very cynical newsrooms.
Well, Well, thank you, Brian, for bringing us a note of optimism at the end.